Rodney Dangerfield one time said that when he was a kid, his parents moved often, but he found a way to find them some way. You know. No respect. No respect at all. Barry asked me to preach this week. He started 2 sermons on Sifted as wheat, and he wanted to move to Job today. And he said, Gary, if you preached on Job's suffering, then the people would be able to suffer and understand the Bible better when you do that. And I really appreciated that. The more I think about it, I don't know about that, but anyway. Where are we here? Sifted. Here's the definition that we gave last week for being sifted. To shake, as in a sieve, to winnow, as separating chaff from the grain, or in more of a spiritual sense, to try one's faith to the verge of overthrow. I like that word verge, and I'll say a little bit more about that as we go today, because he brought him to the limit, to the verge of overthrow. But we want to talk about that a little bit more as we go. So he also shared with us these pictures of what they used to do to sift wheat. When I saw that picture, it was nothing for me. I thought, man, I don't want to be stuck with that one anymore, so I don't want to be sifted too much. But here's the outcome, of course, the grain being separated from the chaff. And their desire was to have the good grain and throw away everything else, the bad, the chaff. Satan's desire in the times that we are sifted as wheat, as he wanted to do with Peter and as he did with Job, Satan's desire is to throw away the good stuff and keep the chaff. Get everything out of us he possibly can that is good and righteous, like God, and just keep the bad stuff. Just do away with as much as we can. So based on that, we go through the kinds of trial in our life. And all of us are going to go through it. Sometimes tougher than others. God wants us to come out like that. Satan wants to keep the chaff. So, in that lesson he taught last week, Jesus told Peter that Satan wanted to sift him as wheat. But he said, I'm praying for you, Peter. And when your I'm praying that your faith will not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. This morning, as we go through Job, I want to give a little more emphasis to these last 3 words, the strengthening of the brothers. Because you've read Job, and you know how they strengthened him. So we're going to see if we can pull a few things out of that. If you've ever had the Bible Project app on your phone, if you don't, I'm encouraging you to get it. Every book of the Bible, before you read through it on that app, every book of the Bible is explained, the total book, in about a 10-minute thing. And so I looked at that about Job, and I said, man, this is great. And I want us to see the explanation of the whole book of Job, how it unfolds, pay close attention to what the comfort was, why they comforted that way. And we may pull some things out that are worth our time this morning.
Book of Job. It's a profound and very unique book in the Bible for lots of reasons. The story is set in a very obscure land that's far away from Israel, Uz. The main character, Job, he's not even an Israelite, and the author, who's anonymous, doesn't even set the story in any clear period of ancient history. This all seems intentional, though. It's like the author doesn't want us to be distracted by historical questions, but rather to focus simply on the story of Job and on the questions raised by his experience of suffering. The book of Job has a very clear literary design. It opens and closes with a short narrative prologue and then an epilogue. And then the central body of the book is dense Hebrew poetry, representing conversations between Job and 4 dialogue partners called the Friends. These conversations are then concluded by a series of poetic speeches given by God to Job. Let's dive in and we'll just see how it works together. The prologue introduces us to Job, and we're told that he's a blameless, upright man who honors God. He's a super good guy. And then all of a sudden, we're transported into the heavenly realms, and God is holding court with his staff team. It's a very common image in the Old Testament describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings is a figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the accuser or the prosecutor. And it's like we're watching a court scene. God presents Job as a truly righteous man, and then the accuser challenges God's policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. He says, the only reason Job obeys you is because you bless him with prosperity. Let Job suffer. Then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. Now, it's at this point in the story that most of us go, what? Why did God do that? And then we assume that this book is going to answer that question, why God allows good people to suffer. But as you read on, the book doesn't answer that question. Nothing in the book ever answers that question. The prologue is setting up the real questions this book is trying to get at. Questions about God's justice and whether God operates the universe according to the strict principle of justice. And the response to those questions comes as you read through to the end of the book, not at the beginning. The ultimate reason for Job's suffering is simply never revealed. So the prologue concludes with a suffering and bewildered Job, who's rebuked by his wife, and he's approached by 3 friends who are going to try and provide wisdom and counsel. Their names are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. They're all non-Israelites like Job. And they represent the best of ancient Near Eastern thinking about God and suffering and the human condition, and this moves us into the main part of the book. First, Job speaks. And this is how this section of the book works. First, Job is going to speak, and then they'll follow a response from a friend. Then Job will respond to that friend. Then another friend will respond to Job's response, and so on back and forth for 3 cycles. And this whole debate is focused on 3 questions. Is God truly just in character? And does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And if so, then how is Job's suffering to be explained? As we're going to see, Job and the friends, they're working from a huge assumption about what God's justice ought to look like in the world. Namely, that every single thing that happens in the universe should operate according to the strict principle of justice. So if you're a wise, good person and you honor God, good things will happen to you. God will reward you. But if you're evil and stupid and do sinful things, bad things will happen to you. God will punish you. Now, Job's constant argument throughout his speeches is this. First of all, that he's innocent, and so the implication of that is that his suffering is not a divine punishment. Now, we know from the prologue, both of these things are true. Remember, God himself said, Job is righteous and blameless. And so Job concludes his argument by accusing God. God either doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is simply unjust. The friends, on the other hand, they beg to differ. Their argument is that God is just, the implication being that God always runs the world according to justice in this way, and so they conclude by accusing not God, but Job. Job must have done something really, really bad for God to punish him like this. They even start making up possible sins that Job must have committed. Job protests to all of this. In fact, he gets so fed up with the friends that he eventually just gives up on them. He takes up his case directly with God. Now, something to be aware of is that Job, he's on an emotional roller coaster in these poems. He used to think that God is just, but now he can't reconcile that with his suffering. And so in some outbursts, he'll accuse God of being a bully. Once he even declares that God has orchestrated all the injustice in the world. But the moment he utters that thought, he's terrified of it because he wants to hope and believe that God is truly just. Job is all over the place in this section. And so he makes one last statement of his innocence, and then he demands that God show up personally to explain himself. Now, it's at this point that a surprise friend shows up, Elihu the Buzite. Now, he's not an Israelite, but he does have a Hebrew name. And Elihu, he has the same assumption as Job and the friends. He argues that God is just, and that implies that God always operates the universe according to justice. But then Elihu draws a more sophisticated conclusion about why good people suffer. It may not be punishment for sin in the past. God might inflict suffering as a warning to help people avoid sin in the future. Or God might use pain and suffering to build character or to teach people valuable lessons. Elihu doesn't claim to know why Job is suffering, but one thing he is certain of: Job is wrong to accuse God of being unjust. Job doesn't even respond to Elihu, and the dialogues come to a close. It's like the wisdom of the ancients has been spent, and the mystery remains. And then, all of a sudden, God shows up in a whirlwind, and he responds to Job personally. He first responds to Job's accusation that he's unjust and incompetent at running the universe. So God takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe, and he starts asking him all these questions about the order and origins of the cosmos. Was Job ever around when God architected the earth or organized the constellations? Has Job ever commanded the sunrise or controlled the weather? God has his eyes on all of these cosmic details that Job has never even conceived of. Then God starts going into detail describing the grazing habits of mountain goats and how deer give birth, or the feeding patterns of lions and wild donkeys. What's the point of all this? Remember the assumption of Job and his friends about what it looks like for God to run the world according to justice. Underneath that assumption is a deeper one, that Job and his friends have a wide enough perspective on life to make such a claim about how God ought to run the world. And God's response with this virtual tour, it deconstructs all of these assumptions. It first of all shows that the universe is a vast, complex place, and that God has his eyes on all of it, every detail. Job, on the other hand, has only the small horizon of his life experience to draw from. His view of the world is very limited. And so what looks like divine injustice, from Job's point of view, needs to be seen in an infinitely larger context. Job is simply not in a position to make such a huge accusation about God. After the virtual tour, God asks Job if he would like to micromanage the world for a day, according to the strict principle of justice that Job and his friends assume, punishing every evil deed of every person at every moment with precise retribution. The fact is that carrying out justice in a world like ours, it's extremely complex. It's never black and white, like Job and the friends seem to think. Which leads to God's last point. He starts describing these two fantastic creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, which some people think are poetic depictions of a hippo and a crocodile, but more likely they refer to well-known creatures from ancient Near Eastern mythology that are used elsewhere in the Bible as symbols of the disorder and danger that exist in God's good world. These creatures, they're not evil. God's actually quite proud of them, but they're not safe either. The point is that God's world is amazing and very good, but it's not perfect or always safe. God's world has order and beauty, but it's also wild and sometimes dangerous, just like these two fantastic creatures. And so we come back to the big question of Job's suffering. Why is there suffering in God's world? Whether it's from earthquakes or wild animals or from other humans, God doesn't explain why. What he says is that we live in an extremely complex, amazing world that at this stage, at least, is not designed to prevent suffering. And that's God's response. Job challenged God's justice. God responds that Job doesn't have sufficient knowledge about our universe to make such a claim. Job demanded a full explanation from God, and what God asked Job for is trust in his wisdom and character. And so, Job responds with humility and repentance. He apologizes for accusing God, and he acknowledges that he's overstepped his bounds. Then all of a sudden, the book concludes with a short epilogue. First, God says that the friends were wrong, that their ideas about God's justice were just too simple, not true to the complexity of the world or God's wisdom. And then God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. Now, this is surprising because it can't apply to everything Job said. I mean, we know Job drew hasty and wrong conclusions, but God still approves of Job's wrestling, how Job came honestly before God with all of his emotion and pain and simply wanted to talk to God himself. himself. And God says that's the right way to process through all of this, through the struggle of prayer. The book concludes with Job having his health, his family, his wealth all restored, not as a reward for good behavior, but simply as a generous gift from God. And that's the end of the book. So the book of Job, it doesn't unlock the puzzle of why bad things happen to good people. Rather, it does invite us to trust God's wisdom when we do encounter suffering, rather than try and figure out the reasons for it. When we search for reasons, we tend to either simplify God like the friends, or like Job, accuse God, but based on limited evidence. And so the book is inviting us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God, and to trust that God actually cares and that he knows what he's doing. And that's what the book of Job is all about.
Isn't that good? I mean, such a short thing, but to show you the whole book the way he does. Let me go back to the very beginning just of what happens. God has already said Job is about the best I've got on the earth. He's upright. He's blameless. He's just great. And so Satan comes in and says, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You've blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Interesting. So we know what happens. Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. So there's only one thing that Satan is told he can't do at the beginning. You can't touch Job. You can take everything that he has, you can do anything you want to, but you can't touch Job. Well, Job made it through that, even after his wife suggested he curse God and die. And I wonder sometimes, was that because she thought maybe the only reason he's suffering is because he's so wicked, as the friends would say later? Or was it she is so overwhelmed by watching her husband suffer that much? Maybe it's just time to die. By the way, that reminds me, JC, my JC and Lisa, I've forgotten his last name, Johnson. JC passed away a couple of days ago, and I've been honored to do his service this coming Saturday morning at Whitten Road, Forest Hills, at 9 o'clock visitation, 10 o'clock service. I'm going to be asking for anyone who wants to get up and say something about JC. I talked to them yesterday. It's amazing, the man. But anyway, I wanted to just let you know that so that you could come. And if you want to stand up, or you could stand up and say something about JC that you remember that's good, I think that would be a blessing. So don't lay a finger on him. Well, that didn't work. So Satan comes back a second time. And God says, if you consider my servant Job, he says the same things about Job. He's still upright, blameless, great. Satan says, we're skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. Well, he was going to surely curse him to his face the last time, right? But this time he will surely do it. If you just get into his body, if you get into his flesh, if you just let me do anything I want to do. And God says, okay, you can do it, but you have to spare his life. Now, I don't know about you, but there have been times in my life, and I don't say this, and you may have felt the same, but I have felt I would rather be dead. And I'm thinking, Job, wouldn't it be better if they killed you? then you have to go through all this suffering. But that's the test. That's the temptation that's coming his way. And God is going to allow him to do it. And I want to know why. Why would you allow that? Why would you let Job go through so much? Well, the sifting is to make us stronger. You look at it at two views. From God's eye, the sifting is always to make us stronger. For example, I love this verse. Count it all joy. Woo, up-oh, hot dog. I'm going through all kinds of troubles. When you're meeting trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. I want you to notice the two different words that are going to be used in these scriptures. One is testing. The other is temptation or tempting. Go a little bit further. Well, I went a little bit further than I wanted to right there. So we can handle the sifting. God is not going to allow us to be tempted above what we're able to bear. But God is faithful. If you think you stand, be careful not to fall. Temptation has come upon you. It's just like it comes to all humanity. But God is faithful, and he will not allow you to be tempted above what you're able. He will not allow you to be tempted above what you're able. He knows where we are. He understands what we can take. And he basically says, Satan, you can't go any higher than this. He can take this. He can deal with this. He may fail. Well, God knows, of course. But this is the limit that I'll allow you to tempt him. This is it. I remember Oscar Wilde one time said, don't tempt me because I can take anything but temptation. I can deal with anything but temptation. And so the tempting is from Satan's standpoint. I'm going to get this man, and I'm going to make him separate from his God. On the other hand, you have the testing, and the words are used interchangeably in James. The testing refers to what God is doing to make us stronger. So when we sin, this is basically saying to us, we can't blame God. We can't say, God, you just allowed too much to come on me. God, no, I won't do that. I will not allow Satan to bring a temptation to you that you cannot deal with. And so we have to take the blame for the sin. James goes on to say, blessed is the one who remains steadfast under trial. That's the testing. That's God. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. God is never in the position of wanting anyone to sin. He can't be tempted, and his nature will not allow him to tempt us to sin. It will allow him to try us so that we can grow in our life. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. So the situation arises. God looks at it as a test. It's a temptation because of my own desire. I remember a story about a guy who had a great deal of excessive weight, and he decided he's going to lose that. And one morning, he usually had to drive by his favorite bakery, but he decided he'd go another way to work. But one morning he came in and he had this huge coffee cake. And all of his fellow workers, were scoffing him and making fun of him and all this kind of stuff. He said, no. Let me explain what happened. And so they said, okay, go ahead. He said, I had to drive by that store this morning. I had other things I had to do on the way. And when I drove by, I saw these beautiful cakes. And so I prayed, God, if you want me to have some of those cakes, please give me a space so I can park in front of the bakery and go in and get it. And he said, after 20 times of going around that bakery, the space is there. I think that's somehow how I deal with some temptations sometimes. But what Satan calls a temptation, God calls it a test, a trial, to see whether or not we will be faithful to him. So it's our own desire that causes the problem. Sifting teaches us valuable lessons about ourselves and God. God wants us to know where we have some weaknesses, because things are going to happen in the future that we may not be strong enough to deal with unless we come to knowledge of that. As a matter of fact, that's what Elihu was saying. Elihu had the best explanation of all that's going on in the world. The idea that they had again, that every time somebody suffers is because of sin. No bad, and if you're a good person, you're just not going to sin. So the only people who sin have done something wicked. And yet Job goes on in his defense. He says, look, I know plenty of wicked people who are not suffering at all. You know that. We know that, don't we? When we have some suffering going on among us or ourselves, we want to know why. What is happening? God, look over there. This guy is a sorry. He just seems to be the worst sinner I've ever seen. And yet he's got it all right. I mean, he's got everything. He's got all the money he wants. He's got it. Why? God allows sifting not to punish, but to save. Elihu says it is to bring back his soul from the pit. In other words, Elihu had it a little bit right, a little bit wrong. He wasn't in the pit, but suffering is used to keep people from getting into the pit, to prepare them for what's going to come. So I'm going to suggest that there may be such a thing as a righteous sinner. Never used that phrase. We're all pretty easily able to say, I'm a sinner. I mean, I don't think there's anyone in here that wouldn't admit that I'm a sinner. But when you're so tight with God and you know your relationship is good with God, he's considering you righteous. And yet somewhere along the way, a righteous person, Elihu is saying, will sin. I believe that's right, don't you? I mean, I have to admit, I've sinned. But I think this is kind of the key to what's going on in the book. A misunderstanding. Job is saying, God, you're not handling the world right. You're supposed to handle the world, but everything bad you punish. Everything good is good. I haven't done anything bad. That's Job's problem in the situation. So we can strengthen and we can bring comfort. Think about how they did it. Job calls them miserable comforters in chapter 16, verse 2. Matter of fact, he oftentimes said to him, would you just quit talking? Would you just be quiet? What you're saying is not helping me at all. So, some things I want you to tell me if it's good or bad. First of all, the friends planned to visit to show him sympathy and to give him comfort. Good or bad? When they got there and they saw Job in the condition he was in, they raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Good or bad? Good. They said, it's tearing me up to see you like that, Job. They sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights without speaking. Good or bad? They started speaking. Bad. That's where they messed up. It's good to go and be with someone. It is good to plan to go and be with someone who's going through suffering. It may not always be good to say that you understand. Matter of fact, I'm going to suggest to you, it probably is never right to say to a person, I understand what you're going through. Because we don't. We may have been through similar things, but we don't understand the way it's affecting that person. And so it might be better to say something like, I know this is a great, terrible struggle you're going through. I'm praying for you. If you'd like to talk with me anytime, I'd be glad to talk to you about it. Tell you some things that I've gone through and what helped me. But I have no clue how much this is devastating you. I want to just suggest we don't ever go in and say, I know what you're suffering. I understand. I got it. I don't think we do. Now, all suffering, here's some key takeaways. Get down to the main point. God is not, by the way, an angry executioner with a whip. God is more like a surgeon with a knife. And when he is cutting us, he is trying to remove the evil from our life. So we don't blame God. We understand, God, you may be trying to teach me something. Not all suffering is a punishment for sin. We just got to know that. Now, we can say that in this world, the reason we suffer is because sin is in this world. That would be true. But not every time you suffer is a punishment for something you did. It's a punishment for you living in this world. And you have the opportunity to go through this and grow or curse God and die. It's okay to struggle with God in prayer when sifted. Matter of fact, we recommend it, don't we? It is okay to wrestle with God like Jacob did. It is okay to throw out your feelings to God. He already knows them. He already understands them. God did never say to Job, you shouldn't have been praying about all this stuff. It is the right thing to do. So if we're going through something that we just don't understand why in the world we're going through that, Throw it out to God. He can take it. I'd suggest we tried our best not to be irreverent, but he can take it. Remain aware of God's infinite wisdom. One of the things that he's going to say to Job in the epilogue, or in the last 5 chapters, or so 3 chapters before the epilogue, is, Job, would you like to come up here and run the universe for a day? You'll try it? You don't have a clue what's going on throughout this whole world. And that's where he starts going over every animal and just discusses all the things and the plants and all these things that God is overseeing every day. And yet Job is accusing him of not doing it well. Well, Job, come on up here. Well, I'll let you take care of it today to see how you do. So let's remain aware that God's infinite wisdom. Sometimes things go on, we don't know why. I'd like to know why. I just have to trust God. Come whenever you have the opportunity, go and comfort somebody. Support them. Be with them. The best thing they did, we said a while ago, is sit with him 7 days, 7 nights without saying a word. And that might be the best thing we can do. Do not try to explain their suffering. We don't know it. And the main lesson of all of Job is God is worthy of our trust at all times. We don't know what's going on. We can't figure it out. We don't have this perspective of the whole universe at one time. We don't know what would happen if God changed that, or God changed that, or God did that in connection with the whole spectrum of everything he has to be in control of. But he is saying, and Job is saying, when he repented, you are worthy of my trust. So, anyone going through pain or suffering, or anyone that just needs to come to Jesus Christ, you can trust him. He wants to save you. He wants to take the chaff out of your life. He wants to grow you to be like God. He will not ever allow temptation to come to you that you cannot deal with. Our God wants us to be with him. So if you'd like to come to Jesus, I'll be standing over here. Anyone online, please text. Let's stand, let's sing this final song.